Number 4.
Thank you. Bill Ackman from New York, New York. For the handful of AAA-rated companies, AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and MBIA, are under formal investigation for accounting shenanigans and are in the process of restating their financials. Like Charlie said before, I think of a AAA-rated company as an exemplar, a company that should behave with the highest accounting and ethical standards. My questions this leads me to are, how can investors comfortably invest in any financial service company when a decent percentage of the AAA-rated companies have false and misleading financials? And I guess the follow-up question is, why don't the rating agencies do some independent due diligence from an accounting standpoint so that they can help serve as a watch on this issue?
Well, financial companies are more difficult to analyze than many companies. I mean, it is more. If you take the insurance business, the biggest single element that is very difficult to evaluate, even if you own the company, is the loss and loss adjustment expense reserve, and that has a huge impact on reported earnings of any given period. And the shorter the period, the more the impact can be from just small changes in assumptions. We carry, we'll say, $45 billion of loss reserves, but if I had to bet my life on whether $45 billion turned out to be a little over, a little under, I mean, it'd be I'd think a long time. And you could just as easily have a figure of $45.5 billion or $44.5 billion. And if you were concerned about reporting given earnings in a given period, that would be an easy game to play. In a bank, it basically is whether the loans are any good. And I've been on the boards of banks, and that's, I've gotten surprises. It's tough to tell. It's financial companies. If you're analyzing something like WD-40, or See's Candy, or our brick business, or whatever, they may have good or bad prospects, but you're not likely to be fooling yourself much about what's going on currently. But with financial institutions, it's much tougher. Then you throw in derivatives on top of it, and it's no one probably knows perfectly what some of the, or even within a reasonable range, the exact condition of some of the biggest banks in the world. But that brings you back to the due diligence question of the agencies. You had very high grade, very smart, financially smart people on the boards of both Freddie and Fannie, and yet one was $5 billion and one was apparently $9 billion. Those are big numbers, and I don't think those people were negligent. And it's very, very tough to know precisely what's going on in a financial institution. Charlie and I were directors of Solomon, and Charlie was on the audit committee, and I forget the size of a few of those things that you found, but what wasn't found. And that doesn't mean that people below are crooks or anything like that. It just means that it's very tough with thousands and thousands and thousands of complicated transactions, sometimes involving the computations involving multiple variables. It can be very hard to figure out where things stand at any given moment. And of course, when the numbers get huge on both sides and you get small changes in these huge numbers, they have this incredible effect on quarterly or yearly figures because it all comes lumped in. Those adjustments come lumped in a short period of time. So I just think you have to accept the fact that insurance, banking, finance companies, we've seen all kinds of finance company, both frauds and just big mistakes over time, just one after another over the years. And it's just a more dangerous field to analyze. It doesn't mean you can't make money on it. We've made a lot of money on it, but it's difficult. Now, obviously, a GEICO, where you're insuring pretty much the same thing, auto drivers, and your statistics are much more valid in something like that than they will be if you're taking something that like asbestos liability. You're subject to far greater errors in estimation. Doesn't mean that people aren't operating in good faith, but I would just take the asbestos estimates of the 20 largest insurance companies. I will bet you they're way off, but I don't know in which direction. And that's sort of the nature of financial companies. I wouldn't fault the rating agencies in terms of not being able to dig into the financials and find things that all of the companies that you've talked about have had big name auditors, and our auditors at Berkshire, how many hours did they spend last year? I don't know what it would be, probably 70,000 hours. And I'm sure if you take major banks, they're spending more than that. But, can they be certain of the numbers? I doubt it. Charlie?
Yeah. Warren is obviously correct that where you've got complexity, which by its very nature provides better opportunities to be mistaken and not have it come to notice, or to be fraudulent and have it not be found out, you're going to get more fraud and mistakes than you are if you're selling a business where you shovel sand out of the river and sell it by the truckload. And just as a business that sells natural gas is going to have more explosions than a business that sells sand, a business like these major financial institutions, by its nature, is going to have way more problems. And that will always be true. And it's true when the financial institutions are owned by governments. In fact, some of the worst financial reporting in the world is done by governments. And governments, institutions like government banks in China, etc. So if you don't like the lack of perfect accounting in financial institutions, you're in the wrong world.
5.
Hi, I'm John Golub from Kansas City. I have a question about the Chinese economy. Some observers have suggested that the Chinese banking system looks a little like Japan back in the 1990s. Are you concerned that China could experience similar disruptions as Japan in the 90s? Or is China possibly, with different institutions, possibly more resistant to economic disruptions?
I would have to say I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a very interesting question. It's a very important question. But I didn't necessarily understand what was going to happen in Japan before it happened. And my insight into Chinese banks is about zero. We've been offered chances to buy into various Chinese banks, and again, because I don't know anything about them, I pass. It's no judgment that there's anything bad. It just means that sitting in Omaha, Nebraska, not knowing what some item of loans and advances, what composes it, or anything about the real operation of the place, that I can make a decision whether it's worth X, half of X, 2X, quarter of X. I just don't know. And I really don't know. I just have no notion as to the answer to your question, but maybe Charlie does.
Well, if you stop to think about it, all of the remarkable economic progress that we've seen in China in the last 15 years has been accompanied by practices in their government banks that would make you shudder if you compared them to normal banking standards. So everything you see in terms of progress has occurred despite the banks were almost doling out money for aid as distinguished from doing normal banking. So I'd be very leery of predicting that that's sure to cause a huge economic collapse in Japan, in China. They've been doing it for a long time, and they may actually be getting better now.
Yeah, we've had our share of banking troubles in this country. I mean, it wasn't that long ago in terms of the savings and loan crisis and all kinds of things. And strong economies come through those things. So, if ahead of time you'd seen all the problems with foreign loans that the commercial banks got into, all the problems with real estate loans that the savings loans got into, you could have said, it's going to be terrible for the American economy. And it did produce a lot of dislocations and all of that. But if you look at the record of the American economy, it's come through all kinds of financial crises with the real output per capita rising at a very substantial rate just decade after decade. I don't know what will happen in China. I think it's pretty amazing in terms of the gains that have been made. And I think they'll continue to be made. I don't know what will happen with the banking system, though. Number 6.
My name is Reza Bostada. I live in Sacramento, California. The stock prices of most small regional banks have become more attractive in the past 1 year. Do you have any opinions about regional banks as investments? And if you were going to purchase shares, what are the areas that you would carefully examine?
Yeah, I don't think you should make a categorical decision about something like, however you define them, small, mid-cap, whatever, regional or national banks for that matter. So much depends on the character of the institution, which will probably be a reflection to a great degree of the type of CEO you have. And a bank can mean anything. It can mean an institution that's doing all kinds of crazy things. There was one called the Bank of the Commonwealth up in Detroit many years ago that went to extremes, and it was very popular in Wall Street for a while. It could mean the soundest of institutions. We owned a bank, the only bank Berkshire's ever owned in its entirety, in Rockford, Illinois, run by a fellow named Gene Abegg. And it wouldn't make any difference whether it was a super regional or a small or a mid-cap bank. There's no way Gene Abegg could run on anything other than a super sound bank. So I think you should know something about the culture of the management and the institution to make a firm buy decision on a bank. And that's hard to do for 99% of the banks. We own stock, as you know. It's in our report, Wells Fargo and U.S. Bank and M&T up in Buffalo. And in all three cases, I think I understand quite well the DNA of the institution in terms of how it behaves. That doesn't mean those places are immune from problems, because they'll have problems. But it does mean they're immune, in my view, from what I would call institutional stupidity. And I would not say that all banks are immune from that. As a matter of fact, there was a very wise man named, I think it was Morris Cohen, that said there are more banks than bankers. And if you think about that a while, you'll get my point. Charlie?
Well, I think the questioner is onto something. So many of our very large banks, both here and in Europe, have sort of cast a pall of disgrace over the whole industry. And that has undoubtedly pounded down the stocks of some small banks that there's nothing at all wrong with. So I think you're prospecting in a likely territory.
Yeah, but you can find a few big banks.
Yes, big banks too, yeah.
And I don't know, if you took the 20 smallest banks in Florida and the 20 largest banks in Florida, which group would be in better shape in terms of the Florida real estate situation?
It's a territory that has some promise.
That is a wildly bullish statement from Charlie. Number 7. I'm going to go out and buy that stuff as soon as we get out of here. Okay, we'll go to number 1. And I think then we'll break for lunch. Number 1?
Okay. Hello, Warren, Charlie. Felton Jenkins from Savannah, Georgia, longtime shareholder and partner. My question is, you mentioned Wells Fargo got to $9, and that was a great deal, it looks like, at that price. But what about Washington Mutual, AIG, Wachovia, Citigroup, Fannie Mae, even some Irish banks that I think you were involved with? Those went through $9, and probably a lot of people thought they were still good deals or mispriced at $9. And now you've got very expensive toilet paper, essentially, out of those stock certificates. So, I mean, how would you know on the way down? And looking at something like Bank of America that was on the 13F sometime recently, what's the likely outcome for Bank of America, and how would you analyze what might happen? Thanks.
Well, there's something you can't analyze, and on the Irish banks, I couldn't have been more wrong. But it isn't a matter of whether they go through $9 or anything like that. It's really whether what their business model is and what kind of a competitive advantage they have. I would say that Wells, among the large banks, has by far the best competitive position, of any of the really large banks in the country. And essentially, if you look at the four largest, they each have somewhat different models, but the model of Wells is more different from the other three than any one of the other three would be from the remaining group. But I was wrong on the Irish banks in a very big way. I simply didn't understand, and I should have understood it. It was available for me to understand the incredible exposure they'd gotten to more land development type loans, not property loans in terms of completed properties, but all kinds of land development loans. It was extraordinary for a country with 4 and a fraction million people. They had money lent for developing properties, homes that would extend just forever in the future. It was a terrible mistake by me. Nobody lied to me. Nobody gave me any bad information. I just plain wasn't paying attention. If you talk about the WAMUs, I don't want to go through all the names on them because it gets specific to some companies. But there were a lot of signs that they were doing things that a highly leveraged institution shouldn't be doing, and that could cause trouble if this model of ever-rising housing prices turned out to be a false model. You can get in a lot of trouble with leverage. I mean, you start creating $20 of assets or something like that. For every dollar of equity, you better be right. And some of those big institutions did some what in retrospect certainly were foolish things, which if they hadn't been so highly leveraged would not have hit them as badly. And I would say most of them, if you read the 10Ks and 10Qs and did some checking, you could spot differences in them. Certainly you can spot, there's no comparison if you take Wells Fargo versus a WAMU or something like that. I mean, you don't have to have an advanced level of sophistication about banking to compare those two. They're two different kinds of businesses. It's like comparing a copper producer whose costs are $2.50 a pound with a copper producer whose costs are $1 a pound. Those are two different kinds of businesses. One is going to go broke at $1.50 a pound, and the other one's going to still be doing fine. And banking has real differences in it, but people don't seem to look at them. The figures are available, but they don't seem to look at them very carefully. When Wells reported the other day, they have an item of expense of over $600 million in a quarter for the amortization of core deposits. That is not a real expense. I mean, the core deposit figure will be up over time, and they are entitled under the tax law to put up, I don't know, $15 billion or so, and they get to amortize that, which is an advantage. But I didn't see one newspaper article or any commentator that mentioned that $600 million charge is in there, which is entirely different than looking at any other bank. But it goes unnoticed. So the figures are there, and the information's there. And I think with Freddie and Fannie, for example, I think it was pretty clear what was going to happen. Now, the interesting thing is the government was telling them to go out and raise some more money for investors. And if those investors had put the money in, it would have been gone. It was already gone, actually, within a month or two. So we had calls on that, people trying to, investment bankers trying to place billions of dollars with us on something, on those two institutions. And you just could take one look at them and you could tell they were in big trouble, you do have to know a little bit about, you have to know something about banking and what's going on in the various kinds of lending and everything. And I would say that generally speaking, for people that don't spend a lot of time on their investments, they're going to have trouble separating financial institutions. I think it's much easier to come to a conclusion on something like Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble than it is for a person who is spending only a limited amount of time on investing to make a decision on whether to own Bank A or Bank B or Bank C. Charlie?
Yeah, there's another problem. Generally accepted accounting principles allow a conservative, sensible bank to show vastly increased earnings if it changes its practices to make a lot of extremely dumb loans in large volumes. Generally accepted accounting principles should not be constructed to allow this result. That's what seduces so many of these bankers into this ghastly decision making.
Yeah, when we bought Gen Re, they had a financial products division. It was named similarly to the AIG when it was called Gen Re Financial Products, AIG Financial Products. And it produced numbers regularly that were always satisfactory numbers. But when we looked at that, it looked like all kinds of trouble to us. It cost us over $400 million to get out of. And a black box like that can produce, that's why managements love them to some degree. They can produce numbers. They don't necessarily produce cash, and they sure as hell can produce all kinds of problems if you have to start posting collateral and doing things of that sort. And I would say it is tough for, you might say, the passive investor, the one who's not spending very much time on it. I would say it's difficult for them to discern when that's going on. So it's not a bad area to just say this one's too tough and go on to something else that's a lot easier. I think you can analyze a utility operation easier, or some premier consumer company or something of the sort. I don't think I would look for the tough situations to differentiate tough industries in which to differentiate things. But there are huge differentiations. And again, I urge you to read the J.P. Morgan Chase or Jamie Dimon's letter, because you'll learn a lot by reading that.
But a lot of the new regulation that is coming, if accounting had done a better job, particularly in banking, and yet I have yet to meet an accountant from any of the big firms who has said, I'm ashamed of my own profession. That's a mistake in accounting. If they don't have shame, they're not thinking right.
Well, with that happy thought, we will go to lunch now. We'll reconvene. Okay, number 5.
Jeremy Posen, Newton, Massachusetts. Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, Berkshire Hathaway has had large investments in Wells Fargo and U.S. Bank. What are the revenue outlooks and business prospects for these two banks, given the backdrop of slow U.S. growth, an extended U.S. consumer, a tepid rebound in the U.S. housing market, with foreclosures and write-downs lessening but still at historically high levels, and the potential for greater than expected inflation, or worse, possibly deflation similar to Japan? Thank you for your time and consideration.
Yeah. Wells Fargo and U.S. Bancorp are both among the best large banks, if not the best, in the country, and they're different than what you think of in terms of some money center banks, but they're very large. Wells is 4 times as large as USB. Banking as a whole, U.S. banking profitability will be considerably less, in my view, in the period ahead than it was, say, in the early part of this century. And a very important reason is that the leverage will be reduced. And that's probably a good thing for society. It may be a bad thing for individual banks that could use leverage intelligently, but the trouble was that they all thought they could use leverage intelligently, and the actions of one or more that were unintelligent about it, had consequences for everybody, which you can see if you view HBO on whatever it is. Is it May 26th then? So I would say that return on assets, even if return on assets were as good as it was some years ago, there will be less assets per dollar of common equity than before, which means return on common equity will be less. We still think that Wells Fargo and U.S. Bank are very good operations. We think they're very decent businesses. They're not as attractive as when leverage ratios could be higher. In terms of the troubles in banking, I think you've seen by far the worst in the past, and loan losses have been trending downward now for several quarters. And I think the expectation is that will continue. And I think banking is a very fundamental business. But as John Stump said a few years ago at Wells Fargo, he said, I don't know why we keep thinking of new ways to lose money when the old ones were working so well. And banks periodically go crazy. It's always on the asset side. I mean, here you've got cheap money. You've got the federal government behind, although the federal government has never had to pay out anything in terms of the FDIC. The FDIC has handled 3,800 since it was established in January 1st, 1934. The FDIC has paid out probably 3,800, 3,900 by now institutions, 250 of them or so in the last couple of years. And that has not cost the U.S. taxpayer a penny. I mean, that has all come from FDIC assessments on other banks. It's been a mutual insurance company. So the banking, if you just keep out of trouble on the asset side, is a very good business because you get your money so cheap, and because of the implicit federal guarantee, and you do get to leverage up to a fair extent, and America's been a pretty good place to lend money. So I like our positions in there. You will see that if you looked at those totals, you will see we've added to Wells Fargo, and I think both those companies are very well-run institutions, but they will not be able to earn, I don't know what the figures were, but I think they were up in 25 or to 30% on tangible equity, and that's not going to get repeated in the future, and it shouldn't be. Charlie?
Well, yeah, we might add that M&T Bank, which most people never talk about, is headed by a really sensible fellow. And it's been a wonderful investment for us.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you'll get the M&T annual report, it's written by Bob Wilmers, the letter. The first part of it's about M&T specifically, but the second part is about particularly the American financial economy. And I would really recommend you read that. Bob is a very smart guy, and he has a lot of good observations. And frankly, the other one I'd recommend you read is Jamie Dimon's letter at J.P. Morgan is a tour de force in terms of describing the banking scene, the economic scene. He has some real insights in there about some very important subjects. We don't own that stock, but it's a letter that I think everybody could learn a lot from reading, as they could from reading Bob Wilmer's letter at M&T.
Yeah, and those people who like an element of morality in business, Wilmer sounds like an Old Testament prophet. I mean, he really doesn't like it that all the really big banks are making so much money out of trading, because he says you're really trying to outsmart your own customers, and he'd rather serve them in a culture of deserved trust in both directions. It's hard to think he's totally wrong.
He also expresses quite a dislike for the fact that a market system creates a reward system where money sort of disproportionately flows to people who work with money, and that tends to attract a disproportionate number of people that of lots of ability that he thinks might be, at least some of them might be better deployed elsewhere. It's an interesting read.
It's one of the best annual reports that's ever come out of banking, right out of Buffalo.